with our colleagues from the Senate, Senator Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire. So grateful we have Christy Houlihan from Pennsylvania and Congressman Jake Kelsey and from Texas. So we cover the country. And with that in mind, the hearing today is Securing Syria's Transformation by Diminishing Russia's Influence. With that as the topic, we will begin with opening statements by myself and Senator Shaheen, and then we'll proceed with the presentation of our witnesses. And each one of our witnesses are really just very distinguished individuals who are knowledgeable on what we're facing today. And I look at the opportunities that we face today. And then following your presentations, the 5-minute presentations, and we will have somebody maintaining the time properly, so this is good. Then we would go to questions by each member of the panel. The fall of the Assad dictatorship was a Berlin Wall moment for the Middle East. For years, Bashar al-Assad, a murderous dictator propped up by war criminal Putin and the regime in Tehran, remained in power only because of their military intervention. War criminal Putin's airstrikes devastated Syrian cities, most infamously Aleppo, creating a refugee crisis that overwhelmed Europe and served as a rehearsal in the mass murder for war criminal Putin's later destruction of Ukrainian cities from Bucha to Mariupol. 1 year after Assad fled to Moscow, President Trump made the decision to give Syria a chance and is producing real and measurable results. Through the leadership of his special envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, and under the leadership of President Ahmad al-Shara, Syria is moving toward a relationship with the United States that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. For the first time in decades, for the first time ever, for the first time in 250 years of America and 8,000 years of Syria, there has been a Syrian president visiting the White House. I particularly have a keen interest. November a year ago, the Assad dictatorship identified me as an enemy of the state, and 3 weeks later, he fled to Moscow. And then 8 months later, Senator Jeanne Shaheen took me to Assad's office in Damascus to be with the new president. And so what a change in history, the ultimate change. I've seen the transformation firsthand. Last August, traveling with Senator Jeanne Shaheen and Ambassador Barrack, the envoy that the president has named as ambassador to Turkey to be envoy to Syria, we met with President al-Shara, senior ministers, and religious leaders. Since then, I've met with President al-Shara twice in New York and Washington. I've also hosted the Syrian foreign minister, finance minister, central bank governor, and economic minister in my office. A highlight for me, in New York, I got to introduce the president to Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State. What a rare opportunity. The direction is unmistakable. President al-Shara wants to work with the United States. Under his leadership, Syria has joined the global coalition to defeat ISIS and is now working directly with the U.S. military in joint operations against the terrorist threat. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah have withdrawn from Syria. Syria is no longer threatening Lebanon, and for the first time in decades is engaged in direct negotiations with Israel. Syria is also open for business to American companies creating jobs in Syria and America. None of this would have happened without President Trump's historic decision to engage with the new Syrian leadership, lift sanctions, and pursue a stable and unified Syrian state. I was grateful to lead the bipartisan effort in Congress with Senator Shaheen to repeal the Caesar Act, and I'm hopeful that remaining sanctions, including Syria's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, will soon be lifted. But the fall of Assad presents another historic opportunity. That is the focus of this hearing, removing war criminal Putin's bases from Syria. Despite Assad's fall, war criminal Putin still maintains 2 major military bases in Syria, the Kaniman base near Latakia and Tartus naval base on the Mediterranean. These bases are war criminal Putin's only official military outposts outside of the former Soviet Union and serve as a critical platform for projecting Russian power well beyond Syrian borders. From these facilities, as a transit, Russia sustains logistics, command and control, and force projection that enables the Wagner Group operations across Africa and help prop up the authoritarian regimes of Central Africa, often at the expense of U.S. and allied interests, and really just enslaving the people. President al-Shara has already taken meaningful steps to limit their presence. His government has suspended all pre-2025 agreements with war criminal Putin, including those governing the bases, and placed them under review. Russian forces now face strict limits on movement. Patrols outside the base perimeters require Syrian approval. Off-duty personnel are restricted from nearby towns, and Russian naval vessels at times have been denied access to Tartus. Syria has also canceled a 2019 contract allowing a Russian company to manage the commercial port at Tartus. Just last week, war criminal Putin fully withdrew from all bases and outposts outside of Syria's coastal region, including the Kashami airport in the northeast. Let us all be clear. Removing war criminal Putin's forces from Syria should be done, and it may take time and create security negotiation, but it is achievable. In every single meeting that many of us have had with Syrian government leaders, we have pushed for the full removal of war criminal Putin's bases from Syria, as well as ending the Assad dictatorship's recognition of the Russian occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which actually are integral parts of the Republic of Georgia. In our discussions with President al-Shara and the Foreign Minister Shabani, I found a clear willingness to expel Russian forces if the United States can provide the right support and protection. Foreign Minister Shabani told me bluntly, despite the new Syrian authorities' engagement in realpolitik with Moscow, the Syrian people who suffered from years of Russian air power devastating Aleppo will never be a friend of Moscow. This view is shared by our NATO ally, Turkey. Last year, Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan told me directly that Turkey supports the removal of war criminal Putin's bases from Syria. An increased military presence by Turkey in northern Syria naturally puts the Russian presence under pressure and on path for total removal, which are dangerously close to the vital American NATO base eventually. However, Syria will not take the final step of removing Russia without credible military and economic alternatives. Much of the defense infrastructure still relies on Russian equipment, which Moscow continues to exploit for leverage. Russian compounds that pressure by working through remnants of the former regime, including Assad's cousin, Rami Makhlouf, who regularly broadcasts from Moscow promising renewed Russian backing. Russia also maintains ties to former officers and regime elements concentrated on the Syrian coast. Against this backdrop, sadly, President al-Shara last week explored in talks in Moscow whether war criminal Putin could provide increased economic and military assistance, including rebuilding the Syrian army, in exchange for allowing war criminal Putin's bases to stay. To our Syrian friends, this would be insanity. Syrians of all people should know that war criminal Putin cannot be trusted to live up to agreements. I'm confident that closer engagement between President Trump and Syria will naturally diminish Russian influence. With strong U.S. leadership and close coordination with our NATO ally, Turkey, we can provide Syria with assurances it needs to break from the Russia entirely and to negotiate a durable understanding between Turkey and Israel, one that protects Israel's security while advancing America's strategic objective of removing Russia from Syria. Unfortunately, not all regional actors understand the urgency of removing Russia. Sadly, some in Israel prefer a weak and divided Syria and views an extended Russian presence as a buffer against Turkey. I believe this is suicidal for Israel. We should work in partnership with Turkey, a NATO ally, and other regional allies and partners, and welcome long-term but limited Turkish military and economic presence in Syria. The correct balance of security guarantees would give Syria the confidence it needs to remove war criminal Putin's footprint, and this will only be possible if Israel and Turkey de-escalate and reach a détente in Syria. I am encouraged that President Trump and Special Envoy Tom Barrack are doing exactly that, engaging both sides, lowering tensions, and working toward a pragmatic understanding that assuages Israeli security concerns while advancing American strategic interests in removing war criminal Putin from Syria once and all. I'm grateful to welcome Dr. Anna Borschevskaya of the Washington Institute for Near East Policies, Dr. Michael Dunn of the very respected Hudson Institute, and Dr. Richard Outzen of the Atlantic Council. And we will now proceed with comments by our very esteemed member of the U.S. Senate, Senator Jeanne Shaheen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am between votes in the Senate, so I am just going to agree with your opening statement and look forward to the very important remarks from our witnesses, so thank you all for being here.
And with this, we will now proceed directly with Dr. Borschevskaya.
Chairman Wilson, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am the daughter of Jewish refuseniks. Many families, like mine, were living with anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. For us, America was a ray of light, a light that shone through the Iron Curtain. Even as a child, I knew that America was different. But Vladimir Putin's message to us for over 2 decades has been that there's no democracy in America, that Russia is no different from the United States. But even as a child, I knew that couldn't be true. So given where I came from, it is a particular honor for me to testify, to speak in front of this legislative body. You play such an important role in elevating human rights. With your permission, I'm submitting my written testimony that I'm going to summarize. We're here today to discuss Russia in Syria. And I'm here specifically to talk about why it is so important for us to get Syria right. Of course, I'm no longer a child, so I know that the issues before us are highly complex. But as we talk about Syria, I am a reminder that America's unique purpose and position in the world is still to shine that light. We're now 1 year into the fall of Assad, and I think we can all agree that the outcome isn't quite what many of us had hoped. Russia's position in Syria temporarily weakened with the fall of Assad, but this brief window may now be closing. Assad's fall itself was not the turning point for Russian influence in Syria many in the West thought it might be. There are things we can do to counter Russia's influence there, and I'd like to preface those with 3 key points. First, Russia is reconsolidating influence in Syria as it plays the long game. Second, there's no indication that Damascus will abandon Russia. And third, it's not too late to take concrete action. Syria is a vital link between the Middle East and Europe, and we all understand why. Failure to counter Russia in Syria will harm U.S. strategic interests, and perhaps for a long time. Syria has always been heavily dependent on Moscow. Not only has Assad's fall failed to change that, but Russia is looking to deepen those connections. And I'm talking about military, economic, and diplomatic dependence, and to some extent even cultural ties. And I give examples of each one in my submitted written testimony. As I said, while many were hoping for a different result, there's no indication that Damascus is moving away from Russia. In fact, we now know that Shara negotiated a secret deal to keep Russia's foothold in Syria if they abandoned Assad. Russia and Syria need each other, although it's clear that Syria needs Russia more. Leaders may come and go in both countries, but Russia's long game is to hold on to power and influence there. For years, American policymakers said that Russia cannot profit from war crimes in Syria, but Russia is already profiting from war crimes in Syria. Russia is well positioned for a resurgence in Syria if nothing changes. So in short, despite our hopes, Russia remains part of the problem in Syria, not a solution. Let me conclude by outlining what the United States can do about this. First, we need to re-examine what our engagement in Syria looks like. When we think about Syria, we automatically think of military involvement. Instead, we should be focusing on expanding economic, diplomatic, and cultural ties. We need to broaden the scope of our engagement, and I think earlier calls for a full-time Syrian envoy, for instance, are wise. If Syria is now heading to a status to be at least a pseudo-US ally, why would we treat it differently than we treat other countries? I suggest we need to bolster our ties with Syria for a whole host of other reasons, and among those is helping Syria strengthen guardrails to help restrain Russian involvement and to give the Syrian government additional reasons to limit its dependence. For instance, we can bolster the role of Ukrainians in Syria and all across the Middle East. That would help add other alternatives to Russian wheat and weaponry, among others. These are the kinds of measures we can take all across the Middle East and North Africa to serve as a counterweight to Russia's likely resurgence in this region. Russia's presence in Syria doesn't exist in a vacuum. The US cannot and should not cede that space to Russia. Thank you.
Simply agree with you, Chairman Wilson, but I don't want to miss this opportunity to speak for 5 minutes. I've never missed an opportunity to speak. I'd like to make 5 points. And the first one is that since I began following Syria in 2005, when I was the senior director in the White House for the National Security Council, I noted that the United States has a tendency to not to see Syria, to ignore Syria. This is sort of deep in our nature as Americans. When I was in the White House, we sent up to the National Security Council about every 4 or 5 months the same memo for decision, and we never ever got a decision. We would change the memo each time by describing the events that had taken place between the last time we sent the memo up and the last time we didn't get a decision. And when our Syria director left, the joke in the office was that we were asking, who should we replace him with? And the joke was, we'll just replace him with the copy machine. Experience has taught me since then that this wasn't something peculiar to the Bush administration. It's really just in our nature because Syria, during the Cold War, was in the Soviet sphere of influence. We don't have a major four-star asset there like oil, and so we tend just not to see it. So what's happened is that this tendency of us not to have a Syria policy has conspired with the geography and the interests of our adversaries to make it the place where they contest our position in the Middle East. We saw that dramatically during the Obama administration when the Iranians and Russians allied to prop up the Assad regime, and they engaged in a major intervention in Syria, and we did not contest them. And the results for us were very damaging. They sent millions of people of refugees out of the country. Of course, they went to Europe. The Russians and the Iranians weaponized the refugees, and they created tensions in Europe for our allies. But something else there happened as well, which is that both the Turks and the Israelis were forced to accommodate the Russians on their doorstep in Syria. And we felt that dramatically when the Russians went into Ukraine, and suddenly Washington turned to our allies, not just to the Turks, the Israelis, but also to the Saudis and others, and demanded that they line up with us against the Russians. And they found that our Middle Eastern allies were reluctant to take as hard a line against Russia as we were, because our policy had forced them to accommodate the Russians in the past. I think we need to really remember that experience when we're thinking about the Russians, the Russians now, because if we're not careful, we will forget the role that this country plays for Russia, and it's absolutely crucial to the whole Russian position in the Mediterranean and Chairman Wilson, as you said, in Africa. The Russian Mediterranean fleet is based in Crimea, in Sevastopol, The Russians don't have a Mediterranean fleet without the port at Tartus. And it's from Tartus that they moved on to Libya, and it's from Libya that they extended their influence into Africa. I think if we want to, if international politics today is the United States versus China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and that's the way I see it, then we want to expel the Russians from the Middle East as we did at the end of the Cold War, and the place to do that really is in Syria. The problem we have in Syria today, the difficulty of doing that is the needs, the tremendous needs of the Shara government. The Russians have things to offer them, including arms, including infrastructure, and so on. But we also have the tremendous tension between the Turks and the Israelis. And I think that we have to see that our ability to expel the Russians from Syria in the end is going to be dependent on our ability to strike a balance between the Turks and the Israelis. And this is going to take a very sustained commitment on our part. I do, as you, Chairman Wilson, believe, I think this is absolutely possible, but it takes sustained commitment at the highest level. Thank you.
Chairman Wilson, distinguished members, it's a great honor to be here with you. My experience with the Syria problem set goes back in one sense about 10 years when I started working Syria policy as uniformed as a U.S. Army member and then later at State Department, but really back to 1990 when I was first deployed to the Middle East. It's a wicked problem set, and it's a fragmented country, and there's been a lot going on. The last 18 months have been particularly momentous. And of the various frames or lenses that we can apply to Syria and have been trying to apply for the last 10 years, the geopolitical really comes to the forefront now. My own views on Syria have been shaped by my experiences in the military, deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, also negotiations with the Turks and the Israelis, other folks in the Middle East, trying to get a workable set of security arrangements and a working, really U.S. alliance. In my view, what happened right about the time I came into Army service in 1989 and 90, it's not my fault, I'm not saying that. We had a very workable regional system, and then we stopped making it work. And a lot of that was because of overly ideological and overly ambitious, but really because of poor policy processes, in my view, in Washington. Some of those things have come around now to the point where we actually have the ability to sew together, again, to wicker together the overlapping interests of many of our allies in the Gulf, in Turkey, with a little bit delicate work, as Mike was saying, with Israel as well. But that really requires that we not rely on the go-tos that we have done in Washington for so long with Syria, which is pressure, coercion, and trying to minimize their scope of maneuver. We need to work more through engagement and through incentives. I did recently complete a doctorate looking at the record of U.S. coercion in the Middle East, but globally as well, and the results are not great. I'm not saying we shouldn't coerce. There are truly bad actors in the international system that need a poke in the eye and a pinch in the wallet. And that kind of coercion has its place. However, the logic that needs to be applied, especially in stabilizing countries, is one of engagement and one of incentive, because that is the better way for us to actually shape outcomes. When we try to coerce, destabilize, and especially a fledgling government like what we're doing to some extent, or have been, and again, I praise the work to get the Caesar sanctions lifted, but there are still voices in Washington calling for essentially a fragmenting and a coercing and a punitive approach to Syria. Well, the empirical record of how that's worked out since 1990 is not great. It's especially ridiculous in Africa. That's a whole other conversation for another time. But also in the Middle East. The way that these sanctions should be used and the coercion in general should be used is by exception, with an off-ramp, and always with incentives so that things get lighter as the cooperation gets better. And in my view, that's exactly the situation we have in Syria now. People are right to have their concerns about Ahmed al-Shara. His background is checkered, to say the least, and he may well have American blood on his hands. That's nothing that should be taken lightly. However, you can't kill all the terrorists. I think that's another lesson that we've taken away from the history of the United States engagement in Afghanistan, Iraq, the other places I served. The best path is when you get aggrieved communities that have relied on terrorism to follow a political path and a political process. Witness what we've seen just in the last well, really since January, February of last year, with reconciliation, not just of HTS and to some extent the Alawite regions in Syria, but also now with the YPG and the SDF, which of course is highly concerning in Washington that we not abandon the Kurds. The way to not abandon the Kurds is not to abandon Damascus. And the best way to do that is to remain engaged and to provide pathways to regional roles for Turkey, for the Gulf, and for others, and not to give in to the voices that say we can't trust this man is untrustworthy, and we need to treat them as if they're all still jihadists running the country. And in that regard, both for Senator Shaheen and Congressman Wilson, I want to really praise the efforts that you've done personally in terms of making sure that it's responsible and engaged U.S. policy that takes the fore. I want to also add that I think, in a sense, this shift in U.S. policy is a test case for what I would consider to be sort of a Trump doctrine. The Trump doctrine is, in place of long-term occupations, military actions, not that there isn't a room for that there should be an economic logic that dictates stabilization in some of these places. Syria is a test case. If, in fact, by enticing and engaging our allies like Turkey and the Gulf to come in, and also Japan and others, we can get economic investment and economic stabilization and reconstruction going, we start a virtuous cycle that actually lowers the tension among the different Syrian groups, but also among our occasionally fractious allies. I watch with great concern, but also great support, and as we go through this experiment, and it's really important that we don't fall back to the default of just punish and coerce. And with that, I just want to say the geopolitical moment is propitious for Washington. We're wise enough to avoid some of the patterns that we followed in the last 20, 25 years, and I think let's remember where we were 2 years ago, 3 years ago, with the butcher Assad, best buds with the war criminal Putin. This end in a way that's very much commensurate with U.S. interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Outzen, and we're so grateful that Senator Shaheen is here between votes, and so her energy we really appreciate. Thank you. Senator, you please proceed.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to go before I have to go back to vote. And my question really follows up on your testimony, Dr. Outzen, because I was proud to have worked on the repeal of the Caesar sanctions. Congressman Wilson talked about that effort in his opening remarks, and I think it has been successful. As I'm sure most of you know, there is an effort now by some to call for sanctions to be reimposed. And I think there are real questions, as you point out, about what that might mean. And so can you and others speak to what the risk is of reimposing sanctions now, and what that would mean about driving Syria into the hands of Vladimir Putin and the Russians at a time when we particularly want to see investment flowing from other countries in the Middle East and the West to help them rebuild?
Thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. The empirical record shows that countries that we sanction and try to coerce, if they are strong enough, will bandwagon and will hedge against us and try to find other patrons. That's how Russia has a backdoor to get in here. I'm actually maybe a little more optimistic than Anna, but Anna is more knowledgeable than I am on this issue about the residual Russian presence now. But I think the overwhelming sentiment among Syrians, those I know at least, is that the Russians don't have a real place in the new Syria, or at least at best a marginal place. The way we can change that is if we convince Turkey, who might be under the target of some of the sanctions if they are imposed as they have been discussed, other potential investors, if we scare them off, then they're going to look for Chinese money and for Russian managerial or military support. The second empirical finding in the study of U.S. coercion is that, again, when you take a country that's already sort of fractured, and then you further undercut the sole basis for centralized power and the restoration of state legitimacy and sovereignty that we have right now, which is Ahmed al-Sharia, love him or hate him, what you do is you induce huge new variables that lead to centripetal forces and then renewed violence. So we could look at a cycle of sanctions reimposition with the naive thought that we can actually get what we want and compliance out of it, that then leads to new cycles of violence and a newly fragmented Syria as we had for over 15 years. So that's what I would see as the risks, Senator.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all. And thank you to the members of the commission for allowing me to go first so I can go back and vote.
In wonderful situation, you need to be aware. Bipartisan, bicameral, this commission is working together, and we have even extraordinary staff. So this is good. We appreciate them. We've been joined by Congressman Emmanuel Cleaver all the way from Missouri. So thank you for being here today, too. It is bipartisan. As we're here, and I'll be held to the 5 minutes, too. So with this, Dr. Outzen and Dr. Doran, both of you emphasized that improved understanding between Turkey and Israel is a prerequisite for pushing war criminal Putin out of Syria. However, when I was in Israel last year, some of the leadership there expressed opposition to a Turkish presence in northern Syria and indicated a preference for Russia maintaining as a counterweight to Ankara, a NATO ally, which is startling to me that would ever occur. In your view, what can policymakers encourage Israel to reconsider this approach and instead explore coordination with Turkey aimed at reducing the Russian footprint in Syria? And so Dr. Outzen and then Dr. Doran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I had the pleasure to serve as a military attaché in Israel for 3 years, and then also with something referred to as the Dayton Mission, working with Palestinian security forces. I take the security of Israel very seriously, and I have many friends in the IDF, and I disagree with them on some of the takes that they've had on Syria, because frankly, many of the security establishment and the strategic thinkers in Israel have seen a fractured, weak Syria as preferable to having a strong Syria allied with Turkey. That's not everybody in Israel, though, and there are folks now that are realizing, and I've heard this outreach from some folks in the think tank world, talking with Israeli counterparts who say, you know, this is too important. We realize that we don't like the Turks right now and they don't like us, but they're a NATO ally and they're on very good terms with the Trump administration, so we know there has to be a modus vivendi. I think one of the biggest temptations, if you will, for Jerusalem to say, well, maybe we should keep it broken, was when there was this dual specter of both continued fighting between the SDF and the Damascus regime, and the thought that al-Shara's government, the Syrian transitional government, might engage in wholesale slaughter or atrocities against the Kurds if and when that part of the country is reunited. Well, what we've seen since early January is actually a very delicate negotiation. There's some military activity with some loss of lives on both sides, and also still a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety remaining. But also the offering by Ahmed al-Shara's government of the best deal the Kurds of Syria have ever had from a Syrian government. That is amazing, and it's a strong reason for both Israel and Turkey to take notice and say, actually, these forces that are pulling the country apart are not as strong as the forces that are bringing them back together, and on reasonable terms. So I think a dialogue, which obviously we've been trying to, I think the efforts of the special envoys, I think Tom Barrack, but also Steve Witkoff, have been involved with trying to talk to the Netanyahu folks and say, look, there's got to be a way that you can do this in a way that's consistent with the Trump administration's priorities and policy. I think that needs to be reinforced. I think that the security dialogue between Israel and the United States, especially U.S. CENTCOM, which has been so strong as they face the Iranian threat, we need to find a way to also bring together security figures from Israel and Turkey and say, look, regional security is United States security. We can't have you guys seeing each other as targets and as enemies if we're part of the same umbrella. So really leadership within the alliance is what I think that both countries need to see now, and Syria is ground zero for it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doran.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with what Rich just said. I think the American leadership in pulling the Turks and the Israelis together and encouraging them, almost forcing them to talk to each other is, I think, the starting point for solving this problem. In my discussions with Turks and Israelis, I'm struck by the tremendous gulf between them. They no longer have the kind of regular contacts with each other. Of course, they do have intel to intel relations and so on, but a kind of regularized interaction across the board in the government is no longer there. The expertise on either side is weak about the other. But more than that, the worldviews are starkly discordant. When the Turks look at Syria, what they want Syria to be France, meaning they want, you know, the French football team has Africans and Moroccans and Algerians, but they all stand up and pledge allegiance to France and sing the French anthem at the games. The Turks want Syria to be unified, and they want all ethnic groups in Syria to be seen as Syrians. They don't care if there's a Kurdish general or a Druze general in the army, but they want them to be Syrians. This is both from a pragmatic point of view, because they don't want a Turkish or a PKK autonomous statelet on their border, but it's also deeply ingrained in Turks in the way that they see their own country and how they think the world should be organized. The Israelis, when they look at, and the Turks fear that the Israelis want to crack Syria up and keep it fragmented. And this is happening at a moment when the Turks are seeing competition with Israel elsewhere, in places like Somaliland and so forth. So they're increasingly seeing the Israelis as a rival. The Israelis, when they look at Turkey, they see an ideological Islamist power, which they fear is going to take over the vacuum left by the retreating Iran. They see the government in Damascus as an Islamist power that wants to destroy them, and that is also hostile to them, the Israelis, in the same way that it is hostile to the non-Muslim minorities or heterodox Muslim minorities in Syria. I think the greatest fear of the Israelis, more than the ideological onslaught of the Islamists against Israel and the Syrian minorities, is that Syria will become a Turkish military base and the front lines in an effort to annihilate Israel. I think we have a major role to play here in getting the two sides to come to an accommodation, and I think it's possible to turn Syria into a buffer state, or to help it emerge as a buffer state, much as Jordan is a buffer state between Iraq and Israel. But as I said to you earlier in my testimony, this really requires a commitment from the White House and a lot of serious work to bring the two together so that they get to know each other better and learn that as I believe, they can actually live together in the same neighborhood without friction.
And Dr. Doran, thank you. And indeed, they have in the past, so hopefully that can be restored. With that in mind, also, I'd like to introduce for the record a statement from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy supporting the Accountable Russian Mercenaries Act 2.0. The reason for that is that war criminal Putin is recruiting troops in Syria to be used as human fodder to join the 1.2 million other troops, Russians, that he sacrificed. With that, we now proceed to Congressman Elsie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Anna, I'm going to start with you. How do we get Syria to move away from, economic stability is a foundation for how a government, their stability. How do we get Syria to stop using Russian wheat and oil? How do we involve Ukraine? How do we involve the United States for a stable food energy supply?
Thank you very much. I think we can start by facilitating, starting conversations, starting to see how we can move forward on exactly that. What can the United States do, perhaps through U.S. businesses? What, in practical terms, the United States can provide to facilitating Ukrainian wheat, other types of Ukrainian goods. Let's not forget that much of Russian wheat that Russia sells is actually stolen from Ukraine to begin with. And Ukrainians are our best allies. They know Russia. They know Russian military. They know how Russian businesses work. They have so many reasons to serve as a counterweight to Russia. So I think the best way to do this is to start conversations. And again, I think at the highest levels, as Michael had mentioned in his earlier remarks, the point is that Syria needs our attention. We need to prioritize it. We need to understand why we need to do this, that this is in our own long-term strategic interest. We also, I think, need to understand that this is going to be incredibly challenging, that there are going to be many questions for businesses that come into Syria when there's so little of physical infrastructure in terms of how to conduct financial transactions. I think we need to have conversations with the Syrian government as well about how to facilitate that. So I think it starts with American engagement at all levels and really prioritizing this issue.
Thank you for that. And of course, as we've discussed, the war in Ukraine is both a genocide and an imperial action that is an attempt, and actually have been successful in stealing 25% of the world's wheat supply from the Ukrainians, as well as the goal is to get their gas fields as well. So this is that genocide that they're conducting there is about money and power, as it is everywhere else, including Africa that they go to. And we don't have time to address all of those things, but getting them out of Syria is absolutely a priority. Colonel and Doctor, I've got a question about the President al-Shara. You know, he fought against us in Iraq and Afghanistan. Colonel, I'm sure he was in Iraq when you were. Can he be trusted? As you well know, the Israelis referred to him by his nom de guerre, al-Jilani. And Syria has a lot of different ethnic groups, and we've already seen 2 of those get attacked from the nominal government as it is. Is he playing both sides against the middle and allowing yet condemning these attacks on the Druze and on the SDF? Can he be trusted? We'll start with you, Colonel.
So as my favorite president used to say, trust but verify, right? I don't think actually trust comes into to play when we're talking about the Middle East much at all, and somebody who has his background should not be trusted in the absolute sense. However, we should trust what we see as observed behaviors. What we saw as the observed behavior with nom de guerre Jilani, Ahmed al-Shara, is that after spending time, I believe, at Camp Bucca in Iraq, in a U.S. prison facility for having attacked against U.S. forces and Iraqi forces, he came to Syria, and very shortly thereafter, joined with al-Qaeda in Syria, which then became ISIS over time. But that he broke with both of these groups because he started to focus both what he was saying internally and the people who have known him and academically studied him for a long time. He said, my jihad is the Syrian jihad. My jihad is the jihad against Assad. Now, does that forgive him for all his past acts of aggression and enmity? No, but it's an important step in an evolution.
Well, while it's restrained to Syria, can he be trusted to protect those ethnic groups within Syria now that he's in charge?
I would say that it's not so much whether we should trust his intentions, but his ability to control his forces, because many of the people that he has working with him, especially the ones that were with him in Idlib, are what we would consider to be jihadists. So the quickest way to strengthen and protect the people, the Druze in Sweda, the Kurds in the northeast, and even the Alawites, who were the oppressors in many ways of the Syrian people, at least the leadership was drawn from the Alawites. The quickest way to protect all of them is to institutionalize and reform the Syrian military. That comes with a stabilized state, and frankly, it probably comes with the U.S. providing oversight, whether that's U.S. forces or some sort of a contract mechanism to insist on reforms, so that the sort of people that have been responsible for atrocities fighting on that side are weeded out quickly, and if they're not Syrians, are sent out of the country. Okay. Then we can trust, but we have to verify, and we have to go through this reform process. We can't take our hands off the wheels.
Well, I'm curious, my time's expired, but I wonder what that kind of a mechanism is, because there's a whole bunch of folks behind you that are shaking their heads whenever asked if he can be trusted or not. And I'm concerned about it too, specifically what that mechanism is, how do we force them to protect those groups. So thank you for the answer. It's a great answer. Chairman, I yield back.
Hey, thank you very much, Congressman Jake Ellzey. We now proceed to Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your testimony today. Mr. Doran, you mentioned that international politics now in the U.S. is us versus Russia, us versus China, and us versus Iran. Dr. Outzen, you also mentioned that your thesis, your doctorate, apparently is on applying less pressure and coercion on Syria and rather engaging them instead. My question has to do with the fact that the current administration has suggested that our oldest allies in Europe should operate with more independence from the United States. And I guess what I'm trying to find out is how can we do all of these things, which is address whether or not how to be more aggressively inclusive with Syria while also not necessarily engaging our allies in that outreach. What has NATO been doing, if anything, if you all would be helpful in filling in the blanks there? What more could the United States be doing that would be the opposite of sanctions? Because it seems like sanctions is your collective definition of coercion. You mentioned, Doctor, that you might have forces. I don't know if you meant forces on the ground or what you meant to be that kind of helpful force. But I'm looking for meat on the bones of what it is that you're actually talking about when you say that we can't coerce, but we need to cooperate more with Syria. And also at the same time, our administration is turning itself away from the allies that might actually help us execute on that.
Thank you. I think the European allies in this scenario are going to play a secondary role, and NATO as well, simply because of their capabilities and their history in this part of the world. There's been a pretty clear distinction since the Suez crisis. The Europeans take care of European security, and the United States and its Middle Eastern allies take care of Middle Eastern security. The key countries are Turkey and Israel, because the United States is pulling back somewhat from the Middle East. I don't think we're leaving the Middle East, but we want to be less engaged militarily on the ground. I think that's been true of every president since President Bush. There's been this inclination to pull back. If we still have interests in the region, but we're pulling back militarily, then logically all we have to rely on our regional allies. And the two most capable allies in this case are the Turks and the Israelis. So the problem is that the friction between them is so significant right now that it could actually end up destabilizing Syria and offering, as Chairman Wilson said, an opportunity for our adversaries to use the destabilization against us. I think there is with regard to the Islamist extremists that are surrounding Shara, this is the biggest problem, I think. More than whatever he has in his heart, he has a cadre of people around him who are quite happy to go out and slaughter minorities. And they need to be kept on a short leash, and there need to be trained up other forces that can provide security in those areas that are not influenced by them. I think the key partner here are the Turks. They are the arm of NATO into Syria, and they have the capability of building those kind of forces. But given the tensions now between the Israelis and the Turks, and the fears that the Israelis have that the Turks might use this to create forward basing against Israel, that's precisely the area in which I think we need the greatest intervention in the shortest amount of time, to come up with formula that will not provoke the worst fears of the Israelis, but will allow the Turks to actually play a mediating role on the ground in Syria, and building up security forces that are NATO compatible and not under the control of Islamist extremists.
So, on my research into coercion, it's not that I don't think we should ever coerce, but we have given Syria a massive dose of coercion for about the last 15 years. So I just don't think that's the right tool right now. Now, you want to keep your powder dry. There may be certain things that we should have a snapback or the ability to reimpose if things go off the rails. But when you're talking about a stabilizing country, you shouldn't lead with that. So what do we lead with? I can think of, especially based on my time in Afghanistan, multiple situations where we had actually done a pretty good job. Kabul had 24 hours of electricity for the first time, female education, girls in schools. A lot of progress was made in stabilizing. Now, that was a bigger challenge in the sense that it was a much bigger country, and we ended up not seeing that through past the 20 years. But we also didn't have the kind of proximate help from countries like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia that are willing to pour resources, money, and so forth into the economic development of Syria. What I would like to see is the U.S. Embassy open as quickly as possible. I'd like to see a major U.S. intelligence operation cooperating, collaborating. I'd like to see CENTCOM there. I would also say that security sector reform is incredibly important, and I think that we talked a little bit about that with the previous question. We have countries like Turkey that can do the shooter training, so to speak, that will go in and do your platoon level, your tactical training, and things like that. What the United States does that nobody else does as well is security sector reform. We have a small number of companies in the private sector, and I'm not talking about the kind that go in and, again, are doing shooting courses and the physical security, but I'm talking about how to run a Ministry of Defense, how to do a budget, how to make sure that you're doing your intake procedures and your human resources procedures so that you are filtering out people with extremist tendencies. We have those skills, we have those companies. There were over 70 companies within the first week that the U.S., this is for a friend at the U.S. Chamber told me, that once the U.S. Chamber restarted the Syria program, 70 companies signed up in the first week. There's a massive appetite, a lot of it in energy, defense, construction, but massive appetite for U.S. private sector to get involved with Syria. I think that that's what we should be looking at, is incentivizing and helping to guide the reconstruction and security sector.
I appreciate the answers, and I have many more questions, but I've definitely run out of time, and I yield.
And thank you very much, Congresswoman Christy Houlihan of Pennsylvania, and we may get back to your question, another. And we're really grateful to have Congressman Emanuel Cleaver of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow through on the discussion you were just having. I'm happy to agree with you. And that's why I've been trying to find out how active USAID is in Syria, if in fact it is. 'Cause clearly that would be the U.S.'s soft diplomacy and maybe even give us a stronger hand in the future of Syria. Do you have any information about USAID or any?
I don't think any of us do you? No, we're a USAID knowledge-free zone here.
Yeah, well, it's all over the world because I've been hunting it down and haven't gotten any answer on it, which is a concern.
If I can throw in just one comment based on my time in Afghanistan, we had a massive USAID presence, but because of the sort of tentative security situation, in many cases, we couldn't get out to check on the projects. So that was you had power stations and schools that were built in remote provinces that the USAID folks, and this is all laid out in the Special Inspector General's report for Afghanistan. So that model of how to help reconstruction and stabilization had its pathologies. And of course, under the current administration, there's been a major reform of how we do foreign assistance. I have to admit, I'm not certain, since we don't have, to my knowledge, an embassy up and running, fully running in Damascus. I'm not sure we have a mission set up yet for and I believe USAID has been resubordinated under a different bureau of the State Department. So I do think there needs to be a lot of thought given to that. And I think there's a role, obviously I emphasize private sector in my view, but there has to be some guiding hand and some rationalization coming from State Department and the aid agencies as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm a big believer in USAID, and I've seen it in action around the world, and it is one of the things that I think we may have pulled back on to our detriment. And so what other ways, or are there other ways for either of you, either of the three of you, for the U.S. to be more engaged in Syria? What do we need to do? We need a larger footprint, economically, militarily. What do we need?
I would absolutely agree we need a larger footprint, and I agree with both what Mike and Richard had said. I mean, the fact that the U.S. Embassy is not up and running is a problem because the Russian Embassy is still operating. in Damascus. It's still open, to my knowledge. I think, I mentioned that we need to re-examine how we look at our engagement with Syria, and we need to broaden our definition of that engagement, and that should be not only military, but it should include economic, diplomatic, and certainly cultural. Russia, for its part, has a long history of cultural engagement in Syria with intermarriages, Russian language instruction, and I think the more people, full-time staff we have on the ground, the more information we have, the more we have the ability to shape the outcome.
If I can add one specific idea, Congressman, the discussions with our Turkish friends, there's an organization, an industrial organization called TOP, the Türk Odalar ve Bursalar Birliği. It's basically a large chamber of commerce type organization. They have a plan right now to go into mostly in the northern side of Turkey, and establish industrial zones. They're looking for a signal from the United States that we think this is a good idea. They have lots of companies that want to go in, and by the way, one of the things they would do is take Syrians, because there's been 4 million Syrians living in Turkey during most of the war. Some of them have gone back, but they want to take some of these Syrians with skills, with their own businesses already in Turkey, and incentivize them to go back to Syria and start a virtuous cycle of job creation and prosperity in those regions. I think the U.S., to the extent that we can do this through State Department or Commerce, and incentivize our companies to jump in on that, to build these industrial zones would be a tremendous way to have an engine for reconstruction.
Thank you. Chairman Wilson has great power, strength, and vision, so he will be able to do all the things you just mentioned.
You're here. Thank you.
You're back.
And thank you so much, Congressman Cleaver. And we now, I'm really grateful that Congresswoman Houlihan has a question, and then I'll have a final question. But again, what you're presenting is so important for the people of Syria. We want them to have opportunity, and what a benefit it would be to all of the Middle East. Congresswoman.
This is for Ms. Borschevskaya. I was wondering if, with your knowledge of the region and your knowledge of the history of the region, if you might be able to prognosticate what might happen. What are you seeing for the future of Syria and the role and influence of Russia? What can we, the United States, do to counter that? And if there's a historical analogy or something that's in the past that looks a lot like this, what would it be?
Sure. My concern is that because Russia is playing the long game in Syria, they're taking their time. My concern is that we won't sustain this effort to prioritize Syria, to engage with Syria, and Russia will take advantage of that. In the military realm in particular, Syria will have a very hard time weaning itself off of Russian military hardware in the absence of other alternatives. This is such a deep dependence for which it's, from a very practical level, that Syria has no other alternatives. And thus far, this government in Damascus is being very pragmatic. Remember, the Russian forces bombed al-Shara, but they had no qualms making a deal. Putin welcomed Shara twice in Moscow. I worry also that if we don't provide other guardrails for the Syrian government for alternatives in other fields like printing Syrian currency, economic engagement, Russia's ability also to talk to conflicting sides within Syria and present itself as a mediator, I worry that over time, Russia will take over. And perhaps that's why I'm a little bit more cautious in terms of my outlook on Syria and in terms of Russia's position there. So I think our best strategy is to also play the long game and to recognize that this is going to take a long time. We need a sustained effort. We need to do what the Russians do. We need to prioritize this country. And if we are able to do that, we were able to do that during the Cold War, then I think we do have a chance, but I worry that we won't sustain this effort.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Houlihan. And a final question from me for Dr. Doran and Colonel Outzen. Since February 2022, Russian forces have suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties in Ukraine, more losses than any other major power in any war since World War II. Its economy is actually less than 2/3 of the Baltic republics and Poland, just those 4 countries, just 2/3. I wish Congressman Ellsey was here. It's also less than Texas. And so with a small economy, which I believe can be collapsing with international sanctions being enforced, we know that these are the factors that led to the collapse of the Assad dictatorship in 2024 and the Soviet Union in 1990. How does the war in Ukraine continue to affect the Russian operations in Syria? And also, it's misleading, but there are online advertising by Russian recruiters to bring Syrians to die on the battlefield in Ukraine, and they're transiting through the Russian bases. Again, reminding us how bad this is and what a tradition Putin has. We know he sent his troops into Ukraine with their dress uniforms because they could be welcomed by the Ukrainians, and in fact, he was sacrificing young Russians to die for his power. This week, I'll be introducing a bipartisan Holding Accountable Russian Mercenaries Act that will designate the successors of the Wagner Group as a foreign terrorist organization. Are you aware of these reports, and if accurate, what implications do they have for assessing the strategic importance of the Russian-Syrian bases, and how can we work with our Syrian friends for the best of the people of Syria? Dr. Doran.
Thank you. I think it's vitally important that we understand the strategic connection between, from the Russian point of view, between Ukraine and Syria. If the Russians don't succeed in Ukraine, if they fail in Ukraine, then Russia is no longer an empire. It becomes something closer to being a Russian ethnic nation state. Ukraine is really the key element that allows it to function as an empire, and it's through Ukraine, through Crimea, that it has the access onto the Mediterranean. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, there's a bridge, a naval bridge from Crimea to Syria. And so we should see this, as Vladimir Putin does, as a complex and work in both areas simultaneously. Having said that, we do also have to be very much aware of the fact that the Shara project in Damascus is very, very fragile, and it could go wrong in many ways. And I think Shara himself is fearful that the Russians may become a destabilizing force. He's made a clear distinction between the Iranians and the Russians, and he's defined Iran as an absolute enemy, and he won't have any thought of negotiations with the Iranians about their position in the country. But not so with Russia. As Anna mentioned, he's dependent for equipment on the Russians, and that's not just hard military equipment, just radars that you need to run a normal airport. It's all Russian. It's all Russian equipment. So there's the fear of destabilization. There's the desire for aid on infrastructure, also military equipment. And if I could say one point on a different subject before I close. I just want to emphasize in terms of the importance of finding a modus vivendi between the Turks and the Israelis, how important the Druze question is in the South. The Israelis want some kind of guarantee for the well-being of the Druze, who suffered a horrible slaughter at the hands of Shara's extremist security forces just a few months ago. So their fears about the Druze are legitimate. They're very well established, and they also intersect with Israel's concerns about threats on their own border to Israel. From the Turkish point of view, the Turks look at this and they see a desire on the part of Israel to fragment Syria. So I think that's another area where the United States really has to put in sustained diplomacy to find a formula that will assuage the Israelis and also convince the Turks that this isn't an effort to fragment the whole country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doran. Now, Colonel Outzen.
Sir, the Russians are opportunistic, and they will look for any hole in any polity, in any state in the region, and they will worm their way in, and they'll try to break it apart and hollow it out and maximize their own influence. They've done this in Georgia. They've done it in parts of Ukraine. They've done it in Belarus, and they did it in Syria. And we made a huge mistake, in my view. The United States did in overestimating their staying power and their strength. And I remember going back to 2013, 14, 15, when there was bipartisan support to do something stronger, more strongly to support the Syrian opposition. We bought this idea that, the Russians will never let it happen, and their air defense is too strong, and the Iranians will never let it happen. Well, the Syrian people suffered for 10 years because of that overestimate, and I think we should avoid making that same mistake in the case of Ukraine. Now, we also can't count on the Russians giving up anytime soon. What they've shown is that even with an economy smaller than that of Texas, they're willing to squeeze every little bit out of their people to keep fighting these wars. It's a very strong combination of deterrence, strengthening our allies, and that means, in my view, Ukraine, which we've done a pretty good job, I think, after a bad start of helping Ukraine. My view is we should do more. But we also have to see Syria as an analogous position to that. If Syria is left on its own, if we don't, and I'm not saying write blank checks to al-Shara or anybody else, I have my own doubts about the man, but through engagement and through strengthening the Syrian state and nesting it in with our regional allies, we'll leave no room for the Russians to do what they've previously done in Syria and what they continue to try to do in Ukraine. And then we will have sewn together a very strong regional network of alliances that restores American credibility. That's the direction I think we need to take it.
Well, thank each of our witnesses for being here today, and I'm grateful for our colleagues. Again, I hope people notice I'm so grateful for the staff here, too. The Commission for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's very bipartisan and very bicameral because we want the best for the American people, and we want the best in this hearing for the people of Syria and for the Middle East. With that, we are adjourned.